And make no mistake, when the agencies make mistakes, so the public should get hold of them and say, what on earth are you doing? Why have you done this? The agencies find it difficult to answer because, of course, most of their work is done in secret. I think one of the misconceptions is that the agencies have all the money in the world and all the resources in the world to be able to do the job they do. The fact of the matter is, of course, they don't. They have a limited budget. If they're dealing with a spread of terrorism, for instance, which is what we're dealing with at the moment, hard decisions have to be made. Decisions have to be made as to which targets to pursue, whether or not the information coming in relation to those targets is continuing to be useful and continuing to a point where the targets can either be put off what they're doing or alternatively prosecuted. Or alternatively, is that information insufficiently coming in so that the target has to be released in order to pursue another target that might be more important?
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. I'm your host, Dov Baron. Now let me ask you, who isn't absolutely fascinated by the world of spycraft? You know, the American CIA, we've all seen the movies, the KGB, Russia's now got SVR, Israel's got Mossad, and of course, James Bond's MI5 and MI6. What does it take to be part of that world and those agencies? And if you had that kind of insight, would that change the way you see the world, the way the economics and the politics and the dynamics are playing out? I wonder if you would see things a little bit differently. Well, you're about to find out, because our guest for the next few episodes is David Bickford. Now, you've probably never heard his name. I wouldn't expect you to. But he is the former director of the British intelligence agencies MI5 and MI6. This is the Dov Baron Show, where curiosity meets profound insights. Tap into our community of deeply curious learners by subscribing now. This is not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. We're about to enter the intriguing world of organized crime, money laundering, terrorism, espionage, and secret agents. Like I said, our guest for the next few episodes is author and former director of the British intelligence agencies MI5 and MI6. He's the author of Katya The Informer, which is the third in a 5-part series. It's a book that Elizabeth Reinkoff Parker, former general counsel for the CIA, said is a page-turner with a sophisticated plot. And Bear Grylls said, strap yourself in for one hell of a ride. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome James Bond's ex-boss, former director of the British intelligence agency MI5 and MI6, and best-selling author David Bickford. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Dov. Very, very kind of you to have me on your podcast.
I am looking forward to this enormously, my friend. Enormously. I see your new book is right behind your head there, Katya The Informer, in case you're just listening and you don't know what it is. Like I said, that's the novel. It's the third in the 5-part series. Where I always like to start, David, is nobody is who they are in the moment. We've all come from some part of history, and it's a context for how we understand each other that I often think gets lost. Give us a little bit of the emotional source code of David Bickford. Obviously now an author, been the director of MI5 and MI6, but where's the story of David start?
That's exactly what the agencies do when they hire anybody. They start at the beginning.
I figure I get a job doing the hiring for them.
Yes, I was born at the beginning of the war during 2 air raids. It was right in the middle of them. And my mother said the first one brought me on and the second one finished her off. So she was pretty brave, actually. I don't know whether that made me anti-authoritarian or not. The next thing that happened was my parents at the end of the war went to Brazil, where my father was setting up an airline that ran from the United Kingdom to South America. He'd set it up with an old RAF chum of his. They said, well, we're going to leave you in boarding school, which was great because it was one of the things I really enjoyed all the way through my education was boarding. It made you very independent. One made a lot of very good friends. It was great.
Were you boarding school in Brazil or in the UK?
That was in the UK, yeah. So that left the problem of visiting them, and I visited them every summer. So wherever they were, first of all, they were Brazil, Chile, Argentina, then they went to India, Africa, and I saw them every summer holiday, which was just tremendous. I saw all these countries, all these people, and it forged a sort of wish to sort of peer around the corner to see what was going to happen next. It was all very exciting. Then I became a lawyer, and I went into a law firm, and I'd been there for a few years when I was at the funeral of one of the partners who had just died, and I looked at the senior partner and the consultant, and then, well, the last one had gone, and I thought, well, I don't really think this is for me. It's just not exciting enough. I need to look round the next corner. Well, funnily enough, my wife, Carrie, because I was already married by then, she's the best thing I ever did. She said, look, there's an advertisement here for the legal advisor to the Turks and Caicos Islands, which was a set of islands below the Bahamas chain in the Caribbean, and they're looking for a legal advisor to the government. And I thought, well, that has got to be fun.
That doesn't sound bad. It's not quite Blackpool, but I'll take it.
But I'll take it. Absolutely. A couple of months later, we were there, house on the beach, and the ministers were very advanced, and what they were looking at that time was setting up an offshore finance center and a tourist center. So I find myself in the middle of advising them how to do this and having really a very exciting time doing it, setting it all up. That was a 2-year contract. At the end of that contract, the Foreign Office in the United Kingdom asked if I'd like to join them as a legal advisor with them. I think that was partly because of the work I'd done with the government, but also I'd got a lot of contacts with the American government because they had 2 bases there. One was a Navy base, one was the tracking station for satellites, where incidentally I sat watching the moon landing, which was incredibly exciting. Yes, it was. Anyway, I thought that the Foreign Office would be another exciting turn. And so I joined them. And my first sort of time there was doing a lot of human rights work and also doing some work with the Americans on countering narcotics trafficking in the Caribbean because I knew them. Then the office asked me to go to Berlin during the middle of the Cold War, where the British military government was part of the occupation force of Berlin. Now, this went all the way back to the war.
Yes.
Berlin was stuck in the middle of East Germany. It could only be supplied by rail corridors, air corridors, and road corridors. Everything was brought in. There was a wall around the western part of Berlin, which was surrounded by Goonie towers with machine guns. There were killing fields to stop East Berliners coming into West Berlin to get to the west. That in itself was incredibly interesting and very exciting.
What year would that have been? Just sort of perspective, what year would that have been?
That was 1979 to 1983.
So the Cold War is very much alive at that point.
Very much alive, and very much alive in that the Russians were going into Afghanistan in December 1979. So that created enormous tension in Berlin because Berlin was the sort of cauldron of East-West relations.
Wow.
And the sort of contact with Russians sort of diminished quite considerably. And then we had to build that up again in order to try and create some semblance of relationship with the Russians, in order to try and push forward sort of American, UK, French policy there.
That's an incredible story. First of all, that you traveled around so many different places, which would give, of course, a lot of perspective. Aside from working in Turks and Caicos and being in these other places like Berlin, but having been a kid who was going to these other countries in South America, one of the things I think we all know this, that the travel broadens the mind and we see different cultures, or hopefully we see different cultures, and we begin to understand that not everybody thinks the way we think they should think. And that's good. That's fantastic. Of course, there's that, and you're obviously very adept with the legal understanding of things because of your education and your skills in what you did. Was that sort of necessary for you to go into the role where you went into with the agencies? Or do you think somebody could have got there with not that path? Because your path is quite unique.
Yes, I mean, people could get to that path without that background, of course. What I found incredibly useful was because one was so young, because one was so independent, one was flung into traveling around by oneself at that age, which taught one quite a lot, you learned very fast that the way the world works is to talk to people. So important.
Yes.
Not only just to get around, but to make friends, to understand how people think. And for instance, when one got to Berlin and dealt with the Russians, one understood the Russians. One could dig deeper into them to find their humor and their sense of fun and their ability to tell you things as it was, which I found very, very important. So, yes, I think that taught me that one could enjoy the company of Russians, but at the same time be wary.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That friendly objective, right? That's very interesting. So how did you go from being Foreign Office, Berlin, into these agencies, which is, for most of us, it's a glamorized, fictionalized idea of what these things are. And I'm sure that a lot of it is a lot like that. And a lot of it is also just bloody boring paperwork. These things tend to not be, anything tends to not be as glamorous as we make it.
Yeah. Well, when I got back from Berlin, I did a lot of work on defense and NATO, and also a lot of work with the Americans countering money laundering and narcotics trafficking again through the Caribbean and into the States. At that time, the agencies were going through a sea change because it wasn't the end of communism, but it was beginning to be the end of the Soviet Union. Terrorism and international terrorism was on the rise. And the agencies were really not even recognized in 1985 when I joined. They were still very, very secret. Part of the problem that they had, of course, was that was brilliant for operating against communism and the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union satellites. Total secrecy was prime. But the problem is, as soon as you come to dealing with terrorism, you have to become more open. You've got to try and prosecute terrorists, which you don't do when you're dealing with espionage. So because of my ground, MI5 and MI6 asked if I'd come and be their legal director. I looked at that job and I thought, well, that's another exciting job. So there's absolutely no contest. I'll go and do that one.
So how did you go from that to being the director?
That was the job.
Oh, that was the job. So at that point, just so we have clarity, are you dealing with agents in the field, or is it something else altogether? Is it more big picture?
Yes, good point. It's the policy picture. It's dealing with the policy relating to the agency or the legal policy relating to the agencies. It's dealing with overarching legislation, the European Court of Human Rights, which is a big issue as far as the agencies are concerned, and also dealing with the agents themselves in the field, advising them when they go on operations as to what they can and can't do, what legalities they have to observe, civil rights aspects they may have to observe. So one's actually working with them alongside as they undertake their operations, which makes it a very, very fascinating job and gives one a huge understanding as to how incredibly competent these agents are. Yes. So I was very, very lucky. It was the whole spectrum of the work.
So I guess the natural question from here is, what does it take? We see, again, it's movies, it's TV, it's not real. What does it take to become a field agent? Because it seems like there's a certain level of sociopathy according to the glamorized TV stuff.
I think that has to be said to sell books, to articles.
Sure.
What's interesting is that the most important thing or attribute that a field agent must have is integrity.
So talk to us about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that seems very curious when you're sending people or the person has to go out, he has to adopt a cover that isn't his own. He's pretending to be somebody else. He's possibly recruiting someone to help him give information. He may be sitting analyzing information coming in, so he has to sort of sit and be totally apart from the information that's coming. He has to adopt a very cold attitude to it. So why integrity? Well, the first thing is that if a field agent goes out to do a job and, for instance, meeting an agent If that field agent comes back and exaggerates the information that the informant has given him, then that skews the whole operation, and it can put people in danger. It can wind up with an operation failing, which means all the money that's gone into that operation has been misspent. So you have to rely on your agents coming back and telling you the absolute truth about an agent meet, for instance. Now, whether that agent meet is successful, not successful, whether they've got any information or not, all that comes out. So integrity is, for those reasons, absolutely paramount.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the delivery of the information has to have vigilant integrity, and at the same time, being integral to the legend. One of the things I talk about this with leaders, I say, when you talk about integrity, you've got to understand what integrity is. Adolf Hitler was incredibly integral. And they go, what? And I go, yeah, to what he believed in.
Yes, absolutely.
Integral doesn't mean good. Integral means you're completely aligned with relaying what it is to you. So you have to be integral to your legend, the cover you're, for those who don't understand that word, sorry, legend is the cover you've got. You've got to be absolutely integral to that, not sway from it. And at the same time, integral to the fact that you are an agent delivering information that also has to be really on point and can't be swayed by the character you're playing.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me. And from a psychology point of view, because that's my background, I'm always really intrigued in how, for instance, when people go to war, they come back, they get PTSD. Do you get a PTSD from the legend? Meaning, how do you start separating? Because when you come back from a war with PTSD, you know, the sound of the fireworks going off is potential gunfire, and you come back from being a legend. I wonder how they decompose that part.
Yes. Training.
Yeah.
Training is integral, and there's plenty of it in the agencies. And that, exactly what you've described, is recognized. On the offside of it, if you like, the agencies are very, very careful to make sure that any individual has access to counselors, psychiatrists, and therapists, so that if they have any difficulties in that area, they can go and talk to them in confidence. So their, if you like, mental health, or what you were describing, is cared for very, very considerably, and it's recognized.
That's really interesting. So from that, let's talk about this worldview, because the view of the average person in the street, we know there's a lot of division and a lot of propaganda around that division of left and right, and they're crazy and these are crazy, and then there's the Taliban and there's ISIS, and then there's the right and the left and the Russian bots, and I mean, just division at every possible turn. I cannot imagine that you can see the world the same way the average Joe does. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to anybody, but your filter system has to be different for seeing what's going on in the world. I know this is a hard question, but what's it like to look at the world through the lenses of who you've been and your experience and what you've learned? Because there's so much deception.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a basis that I think as a lawyer I've adopted, and that is to look at the world through the prism of the balance of rights. I don't know whether that makes sense, but quite clearly one has to understand that whereas one has certain rights on self to protect, democracy, for instance, there are other states, entities that believe that their best way of conducting their own nation is not through democracy.
Of course.
And I think one has to try and understand through their lens what they're trying to get at, how they see the world. From our perspective, I think we tend to believe that democracy is the be-all and end-all.
That might be a bit of an illusion.
To a certain extent, there is a bit of an illusion there. We're dealing with countries where their standard of rights, for instance, is nowhere near as advanced as ours. I mean, we find it difficult enough, actually, to deal with the standards that were set.
Yes.
The European Court of Human Rights sets very, very high standards, usually based on a sort of academic approach, which we find very difficult to comply with. And from my own perspective, I don't think that we should be demanding those same level of rights from other countries. We should understand the difficulties they have in trying to deal with their economies and their people.
And the other thing about it is that, in my opinion anyway, nothing is one-sided. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the geopolitical platform, it's easy to go, oh, America, they're great, or England or Britain, they're great. But, we've done some pretty shitty things along the way there, particularly around foreign policy. And then you look at somebody like Gaddafi. Now, I grew up in the UK as a kid, particularly as a Jewish kid. Gaddafi was horrendous. He was the worst of the worst. And then you dig in and you realize that he did a lot of really great things for his country and for his people. Was he a good person? That's a different question.
Yes.
That's a completely different question. Did he do good things for his country? He did. He brought them out of absolute poverty. And is the place a shit show since he's gone? Yes, it turned into a slave market. Was it a good idea to remove him? I don't know. I would have debate about that. Iraq, Iran, all these places. What the CIA did with Iran, in putting the Shah in and then getting rid of the Shah, all these undercurrent political plays. You've been around so long in this world, David. I know you and I could talk for about 18 hours straight. You're talking about civil rights and all these different things. And at the same time, there has been these plays in South America, for instance, with the CIA and all that stuff that went on. Russia went into Afghanistan and the Americans and the British backed the Mujahideen, who became ISIS. Like, it's not as simple as black, white, good, bad.
No.
Tell me about that from your point of view. That's what I'm really fascinated by.
From my point of view, for instance, I was involved a lot in Northern Ireland and the difficulties we had in Northern Ireland.
During the Troubles.
During the Troubles.
Hold on a minute. Just let me put a pause on it. How the hell did we call it the Troubles? The trouble is I can't quite find my handkerchief. The trouble is where I don't know where the toilet is. That's the Troubles.
Yes, I know. The euphemism for yes, exactly.
So ridiculous.
The essence of the work from the agency's point of view, of course, was to hold the ring between two terrorist groups who both had opposing views to uphold on a political basis. The job of the agencies was to try and keep them apart for long enough so that the politicians could get them together around a table and reach some sort of settlement. And I think the agencies, from that perspective, did an incredibly good job because they did enable the politicians to get together by holding the ring between the two terrorist groups. Understanding that each side had a motive that they truly believed in, I think also helped. For instance, it wasn't my job to go and support one side or the other.
Right.
It was to support both. I'm not sure whether this is answering your question, but going back to my life that led up to that point, I think because I had been in situations where one was meeting new people, new ideas, and one had spent one's life from the age of 6 all the way up to 50, I think, 45 when I joined the agencies, that stood me in enormously good stead because one was able to step back from the conflict and be able to look at it with sort of non-biased eyes, if that makes sense. Bias is incredibly harming in terms of relationships, and I think the more one can abandon the concept of bias when you deal with people, the better.
Yeah. If you were to say, what's the one thing that is the sort of huge misconception about the work of the agencies, whatever those agencies may be, what do you think is the biggest misconception that we, the public, have, the outsiders have?
When mistakes are made, that the agencies have somehow misbehaved. And make no mistake, when the agencies make mistakes, so the public should get hold of them and say, what on earth are you doing? Why have you done this? The agencies find it difficult to answer because, of course, most of their work is done in secret. I think one of the misconceptions is that the agencies have all the money in the world and all the resources in the world to be able to do the job they do. The fact of the matter is, of course, they don't. They have a limited budget. If they're dealing with a spread of terrorism, for instance, which is what we're dealing with at the moment, hard decisions have to be made. Decisions have to be made as to which targets to pursue, whether or not the information coming in relation to those targets is continuing to be useful and continuing to a point where the targets can either be put off what they're doing or alternatively prosecuted, or alternatively, is that information insufficiently coming in so that the target has to be released in order to pursue another target that might be more important.
So again, it's always this bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult. So sometimes a target may be abandoned because not enough information is coming in, but there's another target that is looking much more promising, and the money will go to that target, and the first target might go off and do something completely unpredicted and unprepared for, as far as the agencies are concerned.
Wow. There's so much in there.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult call that the agents themselves have to make. And of course, they don't do that individually. These sort of decisions go all the way up to the top, and the agencies all work in teams. There's a lot of discussion, and a lot of care is taken in working out who the targets are going to be and how much money can be devoted to them. That's not, incidentally, a call for more money for the agencies, but it's not the fact of life that I think the public, quite rightly, doesn't really understand.
And I want to explore in part 2 of the show this behavior that it's not the truth, it's the perception. So I want to be really clear with everybody in saying that, because we're all on the outside, and everything on the outside is very easy to judge. It's very easy to look at Congress and go, they are a bunch of X, Y, good, bad, whatever it might be. The president is X, Y. The prime minister is X or Y. Being in that position is very different. I want to sort of just get a little bit deeper into that understanding of what it means to be inside of a situation and to try and have this wide peripheral view while the rest of us are looking in on a very narrow view with a judgment, and I understand that a little bit more, because I know that that leads into what you've sort of tapped into with your books, and where you've gone with how information is gathered and how it's shared and the internal conflicts that must happen inside of an individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to come back for more of that in part 2 of the show, but this is the end of part 1, and I want to make sure that people know how to find out more about you, David, and about, of course, your new fabulous book and all of your books. So please tell people where they can find out more about those.
Well, my website is davidbickfordcb.com, and my social media can be found on that. Everybody's welcome to have a look and put their queries if they want to.
Well, we will, of course, make sure that the links to all your social and to the main site will be in there. So if you didn't catch that, don't worry about it. We'll make sure that it goes into the show notes and you can just click on that. We're going to be back in just one click for more of this delicious conversation with ex-director of MI5 and MI6, David Bickford, who is also the author of this Katya series and the third and the fifth book, which is Katya The Informer. We're going to be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.